Today on V12 Productions Live, heritage units, special paint schemes, and a little bit of history. From the modern diesels that wear their predecessors' classic liveries, to the steam engines that connect people with America's railroad heritage. Plus, a blast from the past, the locomotive that was painted long before Norfolk Southern's 30th anniversary. And what does the future for heritage units in North America look like? It's all next on V12 Productions Live. Hello and welcome to V12 Productions Live. Thanks for joining us. So you got it. We're talking about heritage units, special paint schemes, excursion trains, and maybe a few surprises along the way. So you might see a few repeats here, but I think it'll still be fun. I caught some heritage units a few different times and in different locations, so you'll get some variety. So we've got a lot to get to. So let's go ahead and get started with kind of where this all began. So this was the first modern heritage unit I ever recorded. It's painted for the Interstate Railroad. I got this near downtown Atlanta, Georgia, in an area known as the Gulch. The Interstate hauled coal in southwestern Virginia. It had nearly 90 miles of track, but it never actually crossed into any other states. The Interstate Railroad was bought by the Southern Railway in October 1960. All 10 of its locomotives were Alco RS3s. Of course, this modern engine is an ES44AC, and railfans call it the Dreamsicle. So the Dreamsicle, it's an ice cream treat, which I wasn't aware of until recently when I started doing a little research for this piece. So let's move on, and we got a kind of a longer story here with the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Nickel Plate Road heritage units that I caught maybe a month or two ago, maybe longer. So check it out. You know, every time I see a heritage unit or something unique on the railroad, I feel compelled to share it with you guys. I've gotten pretty lucky in the past seeing my fair share of heritage units, but sometimes I just don't have quite enough luck to get the exact shots I want. Well, this particular occasion started with something catching the corner of my eye as I was driving by Norfolk Southern's Inman Yard in late January 2021. Yellow stripes on the front of a Gevo is not something I've ever seen. This one was painted for the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, better known as the Nickel Plate Road. And honestly, I didn't get much time to get a good look. I grabbed my still camera and snapped a few pictures. You all can probably tell the unit also wasn't leading. Oh well, at least I got Atlanta in the background as 8100 rolled away. While I was doing this, another unique engine was sitting right behind me. Yep, that locomotive, painted in Tuscan red, is the Pennsylvania Railroad Heritage Unit. It obviously wasn't leading, or moving, but this was still cool for me. Part of my family is from the north, and they grew up with the Pennsy, and I'm also a fan. I went to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania several years ago and picked up these magnets and this amazing print, which is now framed. Of course, I also got pictures of some of the original Pennsy locomotives on display there. My favorite, the GG1. This unit is painted in what's called Brunswick green instead of the Tuscan red that Norfolk Southern used. Legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy is responsible for this paint scheme. He was also known as the father of streamlining. The museum also has the original GG1. See all those rivets on the side? In subsequent locomotives, the sides of these ended up being welded and smooth. This decision is also credited to Raymond Loewy. This locomotive, number 4800, was built in 1934 and served into the late 70s. As I was going through my old photos, I realized I also had a shot of an old Nickel Plate Road locomotive that was on display at the museum. This one, number 757, is now in Bellevue, Ohio, at the Mad River and NKP Railroad Museum. Anyway, back to Atlanta. This unit is painted in one of the Pennsylvania Railroad's passenger schemes. It's got the iconic cat whiskers pinstriping that you could see on the original Pennsy locomotives. I can see why Norfolk Southern went with this. it looks great. It also looks like this train is about to get recrewed, and I couldn't stick around much longer either. Sometimes you've got to take what you can get when you can get it. I mean, hey, I may never see these one-of-a-kind engines ever again. Okay, so coming back out here live, and you can see an old Lionel O-scale locomotive there. Pretty cool stuff. Some of my memories there on my shelf, which I proudly display that stuff, and we'll talk a little bit about it a little later. So let's move on. I was talking about getting things, when you can get them, and you don't always get lucky to have the heritage unit as the leader. But sometimes things just work out. I had no plans on getting this particular one. It was just kind of there. So of course I hit record. I caught the Virginian Heritage Unit on the end of an empty Georgia Power plant shearer coal train in Juliet, Georgia. The Virginian Railway stretched from Deepwater, West Virginia to Norfolk, Virginia. And you guessed it, they hauled a lot of coal. Norfolk and Western would eventually acquire the company in 1959. This engine was painted to match the Virginian's Fairbanks Morse diesels. That was Juliet, Georgia, which is kind of south of where I live in Atlanta. So that's a really big power plant that Georgia Power runs. And they filmed a movie there called Fried Green Tomatoes in that town. And there's this famous spot there called the Whistle Stop Cafe. So if you're ever driving through Georgia and want to see something that's kind of like this old small town, it's pretty cool. So you should stop off there. All right, so sometimes you don't get lucky, like you don't get the heritage unit as the leader, but then sometimes you get lucky and you see 3 heritage units in 2 days, and that's actually what happened to me at one point. Talk about a whole lot of luck. 2 weekends of rail fanning, 3 heritage units, and a whole lot more. So let's get started. The first day, November 22nd, 2020, started here at Norfolk Southern's sprawling Inman Yard in northwest Atlanta, Georgia. To my surprise, there was the Southern Railway Heritage Unit just sitting there. I had seen it the weekend before when it delivered the Marco Polo Pullman car to the Southeastern Railway Museum in Duluth, Georgia. That was a great event, but it's also nice to see things like this in the wild, so to speak. Unfortunately, it was tied down here, and this turned out to be more of a roster shot, but that didn't really bother me. It's nice to be able to take in all the attention to detail that was put into this paint scheme. As I had my focus trained on 8099, another rail fan tipped me off that the Lackawanna Heritage Unit was coming up right behind me. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. Inman Yard is a great place to watch trains, whether you like these rebuilt eco units or their more classic counterparts. You can also see some CSX action here. This is right near the now empty Tilford Yard, but the main line is still open for business. The length of American freight trains has always amazed me, and they're only getting longer. This one had a distributed power unit in the middle. And of course, you also see some oddities here as well. That's going to be a hard dent to get out. Now it was time to head to the northern mouth of the yard. I had heard about an accident that happened in this area a week before, but I thought that would all be cleaned up by now. This is another great rail fanning spot. It's on Parrott Avenue at the point the railroad calls CP Bridge. The SD60E on the side of the road clearly took a beating, and from the news reports I saw, one person was injured in this derailment. I did a full video about this incident, and I'll put a link in the description. Anyway, as I surveyed the damage, a northbound train came around the bend. This one had 11 locomotives. Now, not all of these were under power. Many of them were probably on their way to somewhere else in the Norfolk Southern system, or headed back to their home rails. At that point, I was ready to call it a day. The following Saturday, I was back out there, this time in Chamblee, Georgia. Remember how I said it's better to be lucky than good? Well, here was the Central of Georgia Heritage Unit sitting here waiting for me. I've been coming to this spot since before I can remember. I actually saw the original Southern Railway Heritage Unit here many years ago. Anyway, it's nice to be able to get a close look at these things. But remember, 8101 wasn't sitting here on display, and it was time for them to go. As I watched it leave, I thought I might as well try to chase it down somewhere to the south. That didn't go so well. I spent 2 hours looking for it. And I finally ended up finding it here, near Howell Y. 2 extra locomotives were now hooked up to the front of it. I had heard chatter on the scanner about a train stalling out somewhere, so maybe it was this one. I like seeing BNSF power, but I would have much rather seen 8101 in the lead, especially with this great background. Oh well, I guess my luck had to run out sometime, right? But hey, it was still a great rail fanning adventure. Well, I didn't get 8101 in the lead for that shot, but I did actually get it a while back last year. And this trip was planned. I got a heads up on social media about this thing coming through, and this was the first time I ever saw the Central of Georgia Heritage Unit. So as you can imagine, I was pretty excited. I ended up in Powder Springs, Georgia, just north of Norfolk Southern's Whitaker Yard. 2 dirty ST60Es were switching intermodal cars here. I've always found these units to be a little bit unusual. They were rebuilt by Norfolk Southern, and the cabs are totally custom. I will say the attention to detail on these is impressive. If you look really closely, you can see horse heads on the side handrails. But I wasn't here for these. I wanted to see 2 other custom NS locomotives. And today, they were somewhere out there leading NS train number 26Q. I was quickly discovering that this was going to be less of an adventure and more of a test of my patience. The first train I caught was headed north. The recently rebuilt NS 4363 was in the lead. This is the cleanest freight locomotive I've ever seen. I highly doubt it'll be like that for long. It's always interesting what you'll see if you wait in one location for a long time. How about this turkey in the middle of August? Anyway, back to the trains. This was my next catch, an intermodal working his way out of the yard. He still had a little more switching to do before he took off. In the meantime, 2 southbounds were headed my way, and neither of them had the heritage units up front. This is supposed to be a quiet zone, meaning trains don't sound the horn, but I guess this guy really wanted to get my attention. I'm not complaining. So after waiting a few hours and watching several trains pass me by, I finally heard over the radio that 26Q has 1 train ahead of it, so I guess I'll wait it out. And here's the first southbound the dispatcher was talking about. The anticipation is really building now. Unless I'm mistaken, this heritage unit should be right behind that guy, so I guess here we go. Finally, I could see number 8101 on the horizon. The Central of Georgia Heritage Unit was back in its home state. This unit, along with Savannah and Atlanta number 1065, are unique. They were part of Norfolk Southern's 30th anniversary celebration. In 2012, the company painted 20 new locomotives in the schemes of its predecessor railroads. And honestly, they still look great 8 years later. I got pretty lucky getting these when I did. An intermodal train was coming up right behind me. Now, I would have been totally satisfied with what I just got, but I wanted to try to get number 8101 one more time. So I set up on this bridge on the outskirts of Atlanta's Inman Yard, 26Q's final destination. When I got there, a familiar sight, those auto racks from the train that was ahead of the 2 heritage units. After those passed, of course, more waiting and more trains. First, a local that was probably going to the yard where I just was. Next, an empty coal train from Georgia Power's massive plant shearer, headed back to the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. As it turns out, that train would be stopping for a crew change. This made my final shot of number 8101 a little more challenging to get. Oh well, it's better than nothing. And it was certainly better than getting caught in the rain. Those storm clouds were moving in, so with 26Q at its final destination, it was time for me to call it a day. And what a day it was. All right, so there's the Central Georgia Heritage Unit in 1 to 87 scale, so pretty cool stuff. So we've seen a few Norfolk Southern Heritage Units there, and these are what I would call the modern Heritage Units, but there was actually one that they painted back in the 90s that I would say started it all for that company. I got this locomotive long before I got into railroad videography and photography, but I'm glad I did. Norfolk Southern painted it in 1994 to celebrate the Southern Railway's 100th anniversary. It wore these colors until 2012, the same year the Southern GEVO number 8099 was painted. But I would call this engine the original Norfolk Southern Heritage Unit. So I made it clear that the original Norfolk Southern Heritage Unit. Now, from what I've read, this wasn't, the first Heritage Unit of all time. I think I'm right about this, at least from the research I've done. I think Amtrak, or one of the northeastern, somewhere in the northeastern quarter, they actually repainted an old GG1 in the Pennsylvania Railroad colors a long time ago. And I believe that's the one that's up in the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's officially, if you want to call that the very first Heritage Unit. So we just saw that cool green paint scheme that the Southern Railway was so famous for, but of course they also had another paint scheme which we've seen on the Savannah and Atlanta Heritage Unit, but there was one other locomotive that got that. Southern Railway's green paint scheme gets a lot of attention, but its so-called tuxedo colors also really stand out. In February of 2015, Norfolk Southern unveiled this restored SD40, painted in black, white, and gold. Number 3170 was the first SD40 ordered by the Southern Railway. When this footage was shot, it was on display at the Southeastern Railway Museum in Duluth, Georgia. That high short hood is hard to miss, and definitely a rail fan favorite. This engine is no longer in service on NS. In 2016, 3170 was donated to the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. So those are quite a few of the modern heritage units that kind of help tell the story of Norfolk Southern's history, but there are some other locomotives out there that I would say help tell the story of America's history and America's railroad heritage. 9 a.m. on a hot August morning. The smell of smoke fills the air around the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. As Southern Railway number 630 pulls into Grand Junction Depot, the crew of Southern 4501 is preparing for a trip back in time. Today they're headed on a 45-mile journey from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Sommerville, Georgia. The train, known as the Sommerville Steam Special, passes through small towns and scenic foothills as it traverses this historic route. So, with the passengers loaded, the crew gets things underway. About an hour later, the train has crossed into Georgia, and rail fans are setting up along the tracks at Rock Spring. This old shack is popular with photographers looking to capture a snapshot of steam-era railroading in rural America. That era ended long ago, but this line is still here. It was once part of the Central of Georgia Railway. It's now used by the Chattooga and Chickamauga. There's nothing quite like hearing a whistle echoing through the woods or seeing a steam engine in motion. Southern 4501 is now about 3.5 hours into her journey. She's passing through the town of Tryon, Georgia, known as the denim capital of the world. No doubt, railroads have always been an important part of this community. A few miles down the line in Sommerville, people are getting ready for 4501's arrival. With the flip of a switch, the train eases into the depot. It's now time to turn the locomotive around and get it ready for the trip back to Tennessee. The turntable here was built in 1916. It originally served a 36-stall roundhouse in Birmingham, Alabama. It was moved to Georgia in 1999. After her spin on the turntable, it's time to fill 4501 with water. These days, that comes from a fire hydrant, but railroads once had water towers all along their lines. It takes a lot to keep a steam engine running. 4501 holds 13,000 gallons of water and another 8 tons of coal. She was built in 1911 and once hauled freight for the Southern Railway and later a Kentucky short line. 4501 now pulls tourists for the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. So with its passengers back on board, the Sommerville Steam Special heads back to Tennessee, steaming into the future and reminding us of our past. Alright, so you're looking at another famous steam engine. This is a really cool print I have here in my office. And that green steam engine you were just looking at, that's actually in the Smithsonian. So you can go see that, I guess, once the pandemic ends. So, you know, really hats off to the folks who keep that operation running. You know, they're really preserving history, and you know, it's a place where you can just reach out and touch it and you know, see it, hear it, smell it. You know, steam always smells like gunpowder to me. You know, the coal they burn, all that is smelling like gunpowder for some reason. But you know, it's quite an experience to go out there and chase that train. I haven't ridden it yet, but I need to make it a point to do that at some point. But I can't resist showing you one more shot of this this afternoon that I spent chasing this thing down. You saw that pacing shot maybe in the video, but did you see it in slow motion? Let me show it to you like that, if I can. So that's pretty cool. I think everything looks a little better in slow motion, and that was 120 frames per second. So pretty neat footage of a really classic locomotive. So that was 4501, but it's, I guess you could call it its sister locomotive. One of the other locomotives at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum actually made a trip down to Atlanta at one point during the 21st Century Steam program that Norfolk Southern was doing, and this was really cool to see because, you don't often see a 100-year-old steam engine on Class 1 railroad tracks, so check it out. I love seeing heritage units and special paint schemes, but this honestly is better than anything I've seen on Class 1 rails. Here's Southern Railway number 630 leaving downtown Atlanta. This was part of Norfolk Southern's 21st Century Steam program in June of 2012. The train departed from the area where Atlanta's terminal station once stood. Of course, 630 did get a little help from two diesels, but This was really cool to see, and I hope it happens again one day. So like I said, that was really cool to see. I've seen 630 a few times since then, and I've seen it in double headers, I've seen it by itself, but really nothing beats that, it steaming through your hometown, your home city. So really cool. Hopefully one day that happens again, but I don't know. I don't really know why the 21st Century Steam program was discontinued. Maybe it was too expensive. Maybe there was too much liability involved. These are old machines we're talking about here, so you got to really treat them right and make sure they're maintained. And I think those locomotives are maintained really well, so I don't see why something like that couldn't happen again. All right, so we looked at a few steam engines, how Norfolk Southern and the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum are kind of preserving America's railroad heritage, but let's take a look at another classic locomotive. And this episode is all about paint schemes, interesting paint schemes, and let's take a look at these old EMD F units that have really a pretty cool modern take on a classic paint scheme. So let's take a look. Rising nearly 1,700 feet above sea level, it's Georgia's most visited attraction. But long before tourists came to Stone Mountain, trains were helping to fuel this landmark's legacy. Beginning operations in April 1962, the Stone Mountain Scenic Railroad has been hauling visitors for decades, but trains have been running around the mountain for more than 120 years. This is why the original tracks were laid back in the mid-1800s. Granite. For years, quarrymen blasted away parts of the mountain, shipping their product around America and the world. Granite from Stone Mountain has been used on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, the locks of the Panama Canal, and countless monuments and sculptures. For decades, steam engines hauled out millions of tons of the rock. However, the railroad operation ultimately didn't last. The tracks were pulled up in 1942, and quarrying ended in the 1970s. But that wasn't the end of the line. Nearly 2 decades later, businessmen saw an opportunity to haul something else: tourists. So with the old roadbed from the industrial spur still in place, tracks were laid and the railroad was reborn. The new line would use steam engines, dressed up to look like those used in the Great Locomotive Chase during the Civil War. These colorful historic postcards capture what it must have been like to see steam engines at Stone Mountain. They would pull trains until the 1980s, when they became too costly to maintain. Sadly, no steam engines remain on the property. It used to be a common sight to see these old locomotives being pushed by their diesel replacements, but all have now been donated to other tourist railroads and museums. Even the park's lone streetcar, seen here in this dramatically framed old postcard, has made its way to another home. Today, the park's historic diesels, dating back to the 1950s, carry on the railroad's legacy. It currently operates 2 EMD FP7s, originally built for a subsidiary of the Southern Railway, and an EMD GP7, once used by the Chesapeake and Ohio. They've all been modernized and carry a paint scheme inspired by the Central Georgia Railway. The engines are hard to miss as they traverse the nearly 4-mile route. And if you're wondering if you'll ever see these things outside the park, the answer is no. Unlike its industrial ancestor, when this line was rebuilt in the 1960s, no connection was made to a nearby railroad main line. Eventually, in the 1980s, the park was connected to CSX to allow excursions and a short-lived dinner train to come through, but the connection was severed once again in 2004. Some track and bridge girders are all that remain. A trail currently occupies the roadbed that carried the line out of the park. These days, the trains only make one stop, here at Memorial Station. The trip only takes around 30 minutes. It provides guests with stunning views of the mountain and shows off the natural beauty of north central Georgia. Even though this line is short and the ride doesn't take long, there are still plenty of opportunities to give young and old an unforgettable experience with these full-size trains of the past. right, so do you see the similarity there in the Central of Georgia F unit to those Stone Mountain F units? I think they're pretty similar. Obviously, that scheme was definitely inspired by the Central of Georgia, but two really cool paint schemes, I think. Really sharp-looking locomotives. All right, so speaking of sharp-looking locomotives and heritage, a long time ago, back when the Santa Fe was still in operation before it became BNSF, you guys have probably read about this, seen pictures. They had their so-called super fleet, right, of these brand new wide-nosed GE locomotives, and they painted those the classic war bonnet paint scheme. Well, there are still a few of those hanging around. Now, I don't know about the status of these ones I'm about to show you, but I was lucky enough to see these a few months ago, and I'm really glad I did. Every once in a while, you come across things on the railroad that are out of place both in your region and out of place in time. That's exactly what I found at CSX's Howell Yard in Atlanta, Georgia on November 8th, 2020. Typically all you see here are blue and yellow CSX road switchers and big 6-axle GEs, but today was different. The red and silver paint on these engines is distinctive, and I think most people, even non-rail fans, would recognize it. These locomotives once pulled freight for the famous Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. They wear the famous war bonnet paint scheme and were built in 1995, a little more than a year before the Santa Fe merged with Burlington Northern to form BNSF. On these other units, you can see how that railroad tried to evolve the paint scheme, but frankly, it just wasn't the same. Let's face it, these colors look the best on the streamliners they were originally intended for. The first locomotive to wear them was the Electromotive Corporation E1. The paint scheme itself was designed by Leyland Knickerbocker, who worked in the General Motors art and color section. It looks very much like a Native American headdress, with a red bonnet wrapping around the front of the engine. Units wearing this livery were used to pull Santa Fe passenger trains for decades. Sadly, the paint scheme disappeared when Amtrak took over those routes. But it eventually made a comeback. In 1989, Santa Fe resurrected it as part of its Superfleet campaign. Locomotives like these Electromotive Division SD75Ms worked well with the design because of their wide-nose North American safety cabs. This is probably the most iconic paint scheme in railroad history. How many kids have toys painted like this? And how many of us model train enthusiasts just had to have at least one war bonnet of some kind on our layout? I don't know why these things were here in Atlanta or where they were going. Locomotives often have second or even third lives. These machines started with Santa Fe, then worked for BNSF, and are now owned by Progress Rail. Let's hope their next assignment doesn't involve a trip to the scrapyard. So this HO scale model actually made a little cameo in that video, and man, what a great looking paint scheme. Obviously this is the BNSF version, but just really sharp. I mean, totally iconic. It's just, it's a shame that, BNSF couldn't possibly, maybe make some so-called heritage units that look a little bit more like this. I think that would be outstanding. So anyways, I want to show you guys a few more locomotives with special paint schemes, specifically a few more Norfolk Southern heritage units. And like I said, we're going to have a few repeats here, but they're in different locations. So let me show you guys what I got when I decided to go out in the late afternoon one day. And of course, I decided to do that not really knowing what I was going to get, maybe having an idea of what I was going to get, but mainly I did this because I wanted to see if I could get some trains in really good light, in the winter with the kind of lower sun getting a little lower, a little sooner in the day. I was hoping I could, just capture some cool moments. So I think it actually turned out pretty well, but I'll let you be the judge of that. There's one locomotive that I don't mind recording over and over again, and lately I've been lucky to see it time after time. Of course, I'm talking about my favorite Norfolk Southern heritage unit, number 8101, that's painted for the Central of Georgia. Today, March 7th, 2021, it's sitting just outside of Inman Yard in Atlanta, Georgia. I'd actually seen this train, NS-153, earlier in the day in Chamblee, Georgia, but I didn't have enough time to set up before he took off. Well, I had plenty of time now. I should mention there was a derailment at this location in November of 2020 and not all of the wreckage has been cleaned up. I've railfanned this location many times. The railroad calls it CP Bridge, and I would call it a major hotspot for watching trains in Atlanta. This one snuck up on me while I was waiting for number 8101 to leave. Of course, it had a distributed power or DP unit, a common sight on the railroad these days. After that train passed, it was time to get some shots of the Central of Georgia Heritage Unit in motion. And remember how I called this a hotspot? Well, there were several other rail fans out here taking pictures too. Let's face it, there's something cool about seeing one-of-a-kind paint schemes. And for me, this one is hands down the best. I just had to have the HO scale model of 8101 right after it was released. I still display it, even though I don't currently have a model railroad. Anyway, back to the real thing. I knew there was another heritage unit lurking around here somewhere. I had seen the nickel plate road locomotive about an hour earlier, but again, I didn't have time to set up. Well, here it was, on the front of NS-231, headed to Austell, Georgia. I saw this locomotive not too long ago, but it wasn't leading and it certainly wasn't in sunlight as good as this. There are benefits to shooting in the late afternoon and early morning during winter. The sun is lower instead of straight overhead. That being said, my advice would be to take pictures and videos whenever you want. I think you can get good results in a variety of conditions. Before I decided to call it a day, I wanted to get one more shot. In this case, the light wasn't really in my favor, but I think it turned out well. You can see the engineer checking his mirror to make sure the train is clearing the switch. You can also really feel the power of the locomotives as they pass under me. Overall, it was a great afternoon to be trackside. Sure, I've seen these heritage units before, but I'm going to keep recording these things until they're gone, which hopefully won't be anytime soon. You saw my HO scale model made yet another cameo in one of my videos in this live stream here. So I love that thing, and obviously, yeah, I'm a big Central Georgia fan, maybe a little bit too big of a fan. I keep recording it over and over again, but, whatever. It's cool to me. It's fun. It's just something different to do. So, okay, that was the last heritage unit, Norfolk Southern heritage unit for this live stream. Let's take a look at another special paint scheme, and I think, at least on the East Coast, Norfolk Southern is kind of famous for doing custom liveries. So this is a little bit different. It's one of their rebuilt locomotives. So this obviously isn't a heritage unit, but it's still pretty cool. It's one of Norfolk Southern's DC to AC conversion units. That means it now has alternating current instead of direct current traction motors. AC traction motors are much simpler and more reliable. It also has a new wide-nose cab similar to a Jevo. The paint is gray, black, and Tuscan red. Remember that color from the Pennsy engine? So that Tuscan red, I guess they had some paint left over, so they used a little bit of it on that DC to AC conversion unit. All right, so we're talking about special paint schemes, and there's some environmentally friendly locomotives that I see all the time here in Atlanta, and I'm sure you can see them on other parts of the Norfolk Southern system. And some of these are what are called slugs, and I'll explain that in this video. Another sunny day in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. This looks like a normal light engine move, and it is, except one of these units doesn't actually have an engine. Norfolk Southern number 649 is what's called a slug, and even though it may seem like a bit of an oddity, it's become commonplace around the U.S. So what is a slug? Well, let's take a close look at this unit that stopped in South Atlanta. This is what Norfolk Southern calls an RP-M4C, and it's great for jobs requiring maximum tractive effort at low speeds. One of the first things you might notice is how quiet this thing is. Well, of course it is. It has no engine. Instead, it only has traction motors. Those electric motors are powered by the locomotive it's mated with. In this case, 4721, a GP33 ECO, or ECO. This locomotive is known as a mother unit and was rebuilt from an older engine by Norfolk Southern. Units like these are designed to be more environmentally friendly, but they're still diesel-electric locomotives, meaning they have diesel prime movers powering electric traction motors at each axle. In this configuration, they're not just powering their own motors, but also the motors of the slug. Diesel-electric locomotives can't effectively use all their power at low speeds. In fact, their wheels could slip if too much power is applied while pulling a heavy load. But applying this power to extra traction motors helps them achieve greater tractive effort. Here are all the connections needed to make this work. You'll also note that this slug has a fuel tank. It was rebuilt from a former locomotive. In this overhead shot, you can also see all the ventilation fans and diesel exhaust the unit is missing. But what you don't see is the ballast that's been added to give 653 more weight since it does not have a prime mover. This also helps increase traction. Now, this unit has a distinctive feature that not all slugs have: dynamic brakes. You can see some of the cooling equipment at the top center of it. This means the engineer can basically turn the traction motors into generators to help slow down the train. 653 is what's known as a road slug, and it can often be seen switching local industries. Of course, there are also slugs that you'll pretty much only see in yards. NS number 892, working Brosnan Yard in Macon, Georgia, is a good example of this. It was rebuilt from EMD SD40-2 parts and is mated with an SD33 ECO. The large hump in the middle houses dynamic braking equipment. So, now that we've seen some slugs in action, there's still one more question to answer. How'd they get that name? Well, from the research I've done, it's pretty simple, because they perform well doing work at low speeds. So, there you go, another interesting piece of engineering that helps the railroad get the job done. One of the things I find really interesting about railroads and rail fanning is just, the second and third lives a lot of these locomotives have. I mean, if you look up a road number of a locomotive, you can really see, if it's, one of these like GP units, just how long they've been on the rails. I mean, the railroads really just keep using them and rebuilding them, and I think that's great. I wish we could do that with more of the things in our lives, but some things just don't last as long, or maybe they're not taken care of well enough. But locomotives, it's still a fairly simple concept, a fairly simple design. Obviously, they've been modernized in the past, but I think the concept of a diesel engine powering electric traction motors, it's still what they're doing. So that's pretty interesting stuff. All right, so let's take a look at one more Norfolk Southern paint scheme. And of course, I know we've seen a lot of Norfolk Southern today, but that's where I live. I live in their territory, so I see a lot of that stuff. And this one is honestly pretty important when it comes to railroad safety. Okay, so these aren't all that uncommon. Norfolk Southern has quite a few locomotives painted with the Operation Lifesaver logo. You all probably already know Operation Lifesaver's mission is to educate people about railroad safety. Its "Look, Listen, and Live" slogan is painted on the side of these classic SD40s. And of course, let's move on to, I know we've not really mentioned a lot of railroads that have heritage units like Union Pacific and some of the Canadian locomotives that just came out. I haven't seen those, unfortunately. I'd really like to, but you know, it's not all that often that the UP ones make their way over to Georgia, but you know, sometimes they do, and I'll have to be on the lookout for those. I know some of you guys watching have actually gotten them in Georgia before, so one day, hopefully, I'll get that. But let me show you the one Amtrak heritage unit that I've gotten. And again, unfortunately, it wasn't leading, but it's still, honestly, as far as special paint schemes go, it's one of my favorites of all time. Here's the only Amtrak heritage unit I've seen so far. It's painted in the company's Phase 3 scheme. Today, it's the number 2 engine on Amtrak number 19, the Crescent in Atlanta, Georgia. The Phase 3 livery was introduced in 1976. Some of Amtrak's newer equipment, including a few of the cars on this train, wear an updated version of this paint scheme. Alright, so I think you guys by now have seen Amtrak's big announcement about their 50th anniversary, so let's have a little discussion about that. Okay, we can't talk about this past Amtrak heritage unit without looking at the renderings the company just released with all new retro paint schemes. Amtrak showed these off in a recent YouTube video, and this is all part of its 50th anniversary. So those look pretty cool. Why don't we take a look at these in a little bit more detail. First, we'll start off with the Charger here. Man, that's pretty sharp, and my understanding, the story behind this one is this was like the day one livery of the very first, Amtrak painted locomotive back when they started in the 70s. And this is actually, I believe, going to be their first Charger, I guess. So it's fitting to have that paint scheme, which is looks pretty sharp. I like it. It's different. It's pretty rare. You don't see a whole lot of photographs of that specific paint scheme. I think it was an E unit that was painted with that. All right, so let's move on to this next unit here. And what is this? The Phase 6 50th anniversary unit. That looks pretty sharp. I don't know that it obviously doesn't really throw back to any kind of any older paint schemes, but it still looks good. All right, Phase 1. Obviously, that is a historic paint scheme. Kind of got the Amtrak arrows on there, and that red and black nose. Obviously, it must be difficult for some of these industrial designers to adapt, these older paint schemes to these modern locomotives. I mean, the lines on these machines are a lot different than they were on the old E units and F units that Amtrak kind of was handed down from the old passenger railroads. But I think overall the industrial designers, they've done a pretty good job adapting these. So let's take a look at this. This is not really throwing back to anything. This is called the Midnight Blue engine, and I believe they're painting that just to honor the employees who work throughout the night to provide reliable Amtrak service to their customers. So it's a pretty simple paint scheme, but still pretty cool. All right, so one more, and honestly, this is my favorite out of the new ones they've come out with. Honestly, my favorite is still just the Phase 3, the GE unit in the Phase 3 that I showed in that video a few minutes ago. But this is basically what they would have painted a Dash 8 with, and this was called kind of like the Pepsi can scheme, which I guess it does kind of resemble the Pepsi colors. But this is pretty cool, very very distinctive. So pretty neat. Pretty neat stuff, and I'm excited that Amtrak is doing this for their 50th anniversary. That's pretty exciting stuff. All right, guys. Well, I'm actually going to leave you with one more video, and these aren't any particularly special paint schemes, but you're going to see a lot of different Class 1 locomotive liveries on one consist, So I hope you get a kick out of this final video. Of course, as always, I really appreciate you guys watching, watching the live streams, watching the other content I put out there. And of course, I've got a whole backlog of YouTube videos that I need to put together for you guys, and there's always new things happening. So obviously I appreciate you guys staying tuned and liking, subscribing, commenting. Of course, I do actually read all those comments, and I try to respond to just about all of them, if not give them a little heart or something, just to show you guys I'm watching things. So this is great. I mean, this is just something I enjoy doing, doing railroad videos, talking about trains with you guys, showing off what I've seen, and then hearing about what you guys see out there. So thanks again, and I'm going to leave you with this video.